The scent of chocolate drifted through the bitter winter air of Hürtgen, Germany, on December 12, 1944. Margaret Schultz, a 37-year-old schoolteacher who had not tasted real chocolate in nearly 5 years, found herself unconsciously following the aroma, her 11-year-old daughter Greta trailing behind her. The snow crunched beneath their worn boots as they navigated through the devastated remains of their village. The fighting had moved eastward just 3 days prior, leaving behind American soldiers who now occupied what remained of their homes and public buildings. Propaganda Minister Goebbels had warned them for years about the barbaric American troops who would surely torture, rape, and murder German civilians without mercy. Yet what Margaret saw when she rounded the corner of a partially collapsed church defied 12 years of National Socialist indoctrination. 7 American soldiers surrounded by no fewer than 15 German children, all laughing, some sitting on the Americans' laps, others reaching eagerly for steaming cups of what appeared to be hot cocoa. One soldier, a tall man with a weather-beaten face, was breaking apart chocolate bars and distributing pieces to the waiting children. Another was opening what looked like tins of milk. A third soldier noticed Margaret and her daughter standing frozen at the edge of the gathering. He smiled and gestured for them to join, holding up a canteen cup filled with the dark, sweet liquid. "Kommen Sie," he said in broken German, "Schokolade für alle Kinder," chocolate for all children. Margaret felt her daughter tugging at her sleeve, eyes pleading, but remained rooted in place. These were the enemy, the capitalist gangsters, the criminals, the mongrelized hordes that Hitler had warned would destroy German culture. Yet, here they were, sharing their rations with hungry German children just days after fierce combat had claimed hundreds of lives on both sides. What Margaret witnessed that cold December morning would be the first crack in a foundational belief system that would ultimately shatter under the weight of observable reality, reality where the supposed barbarians showed more humanity than the regime that had promised to elevate Germans to their rightful place as masters of Europe. The Germany that Margaret Schultz knew in 1944 bore little resemblance to the prosperous nation that had existed before Hitler's rise to power. 12 years of National Socialist rule had transformed German society through a combination of propaganda, terror, and war mobilization that touched every aspect of civilian life. Since 1933, Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda had carefully constructed an image of Germany's enemies, particularly the Americans, as culturally degenerate, morally bankrupt, and racially impure. Official newsreels portrayed Americans as either decadent plutocrats or impoverished victims of Jewish financial manipulation. According to Nazi propaganda, American soldiers were criminals released from prisons specifically to fight against the Third Reich, motivated by promises of German wealth and women. By 1944, the average German civilian had endured years of increasing deprivation. Rationing had begun before the war, with coffee becoming unavailable to civilians as early as 1937. Chocolate, once a common treat, disappeared from civilian shops entirely by 1941. The standard civilian ration in late 1944 provided approximately 1,500 calories daily, barely enough for subsistence, especially for those engaged in physical labor. Meat was limited to 250 grams per week, while fats were restricted to 280 grams. Sugar rations had been reduced to 300 grams monthly. Children received special supplementary rations, but by late 1944, even these had been severely reduced. In stark contrast, the average American soldier in Europe received approximately 4,000 daily calories, often supplemented by additional items from Red Cross packages and local acquisitions. Each American infantry division required approximately 700 tons of supplies daily, more than many small German cities received in a month. The logistical capacity of the American military represented a level of industrial production that seemed almost mythological to German civilians who had been told their nation possessed the greatest economic system in the world. Margaret Schultz had been a loyal party member since 1937, joining primarily to advance her teaching career. Her husband, Werner, had been killed on the Eastern Front in 1943, leaving her to raise their daughter alone. As a teacher, she had been required to incorporate National Socialist ideology into every subject, from mathematics to literature. She had dutifully taught her students that Americans were culturally inferior, physically weak due to racial mixing, and morally corrupt from Jewish influence and Negro culture. Her classroom featured prominently displayed portraits of Hitler and weekly readings from Der Stürmer, the virulently anti-Semitic newspaper that frequently characterized Americans as puppets of international Jewry. The military situation that brought American troops to Hurtgen in December 1944 was the result of the failed German offensive in the Ardennes, later known as the Battle of the Bulge. As German forces attempted their last major offensive on the Western Front, American troops consolidated positions in villages like Hurtgen, which had been devastated by weeks of artillery bombardment and house-to-house fighting. The village that had once been home to 863 people now sheltered fewer than 300, mostly women, children, and elderly men. Many buildings had been reduced to rubble, and those that remained standing were severely damaged. The winter of 1944 was particularly harsh, with temperatures regularly dropping below freezing and food supplies critically low. For the American soldiers of the 28th Infantry Division who occupied Hurtgen, the civilian population presented both a humanitarian challenge and a security concern. Military directives strictly forbade fraternization with German civilians, yet the presence of malnourished children proved difficult for many soldiers to ignore. Most American combat troops carried chocolate D rations, dense, high-calorie chocolate bars designed as emergency rations, as well as regular chocolate bars in their K rations. While many Germans had been expecting brutality from their American conquerors, the reality of their behavior, particularly toward children, would begin a process of reevaluation that would ultimately contribute to the denazification of an entire generation. When Technical Sergeant James Hendricks of the 112th Infantry Regiment decided to share his unit's hot chocolate ration with local children on that December morning, he could not have known the profound impact this simple act of kindness would have on witnesses like Margaret Schultz. Hendricks, a 32-year-old former school teacher from Pennsylvania, had been fighting across Europe since the Normandy landings 6 months earlier. His unit had suffered heavy casualties in the Hurtgen Forest campaign, losing over 40% of its combat strength in just 3 weeks of fighting. The impromptu chocolate distribution that morning began when a small boy approached their position, visibly malnourished and shivering in the cold. "I couldn't just turn him away," Hendricks would later write in a letter to his wife. "I gave him a piece of my chocolate bar, and within minutes there were a dozen kids appearing out of nowhere. They looked like they hadn't had a decent meal in months. Some of them reminded me of my students back home. We had this surplus cocoa powder from our rations, and Johnson had the idea to heat up some water and make hot chocolate for them all. Fraternization be damned, these were just hungry kids." For Margaret Schultz, the initial encounter with the American soldiers created a profound cognitive dissonance. She stood at the periphery of the gathering, watching as her daughter cautiously accepted a cup of hot cocoa from the American sergeant. The rich aroma of chocolate, real chocolate, not the ersatz version made from beet sugar that had occasionally been available early in the war, triggered memories of pre-war comfort that seemed to belong to another lifetime. The American soldier's smile as he handed the steaming cup to Greta contained none of the malice or contempt that years of propaganda had led her to expect. "Langsam trinken," the soldier said slowly in his accented German. "Drink slowly." He pantomimed small sips. "Ah, hot," he added in English. Margarete watched as her daughter took a tentative sip and then broke into a smile that she hadn't seen in years. The simple pleasure of hot chocolate, something that had once been commonplace, now seemed miraculous. What struck Margaret most forcefully was not just the kindness being shown to German children by the supposed enemy, but the casual abundance displayed in the act. The Americans were treating chocolate and sugar as ordinary items to be shared freely, when for years these had been precious luxuries in Germany, available only on special occasions, if at all. Over the following days, Margaret's curiosity overcame her fear and party-indoctrinated hostility. She began observing the American soldiers more closely as they established their headquarters in what remained of the village school. What she witnessed was a cascading series of revelations about American material abundance that fundamentally challenged her understanding of the war and Germany's place in it. The Americans seemed to have an inexhaustible supply of everything. Their standard rations, called K-rations, she learned, contained items that had disappeared from German markets years ago. Each soldier received 3 boxed meals daily, containing canned meat, cheese, biscuits, chocolate, coffee, sugar, and even cigarettes. They supplemented these with additional supplies that arrived almost daily. In contrast, German soldiers on the front had been subsisting on increasingly meager rations, often reduced to 1,000 calories or less by late 1944. "They throw away more food than we eat," remarked Elizabeth Krauss, another village resident, as they watched American soldiers discard partially eaten ration items into a waste pit. "My husband wrote from the Eastern Front that they were eating horse meat and bread made from sawdust. And here, these Americans are tossing away canned ham." 4 days after the hot chocolate incident, Margaret encountered Master Sergeant William Cooper supervising the unloading of supplies from a convoy of 6 trucks. The sheer volume of materials being delivered to just one company of American soldiers was staggering. She watched as carton after carton of canned goods, medical supplies, ammunition, fuel, and winter clothing was efficiently distributed. When Cooper noticed her watching, he offered her a cigarette, an item so scarce in Germany that it had become currency. "No, thank you," she declined in her limited English. Cooper shrugged and lit the cigarette himself, casually discarding the match. Even this small act seemed wasteful to Margaret, who knew that matches were strictly rationed in German households. "You teach her, yes?" Cooper asked, having recognized her from the school building. Margaret nodded. "Me too," he said, pointing to himself. Before, he made a gesture mimicking a gun firing. This unexpected commonality, that this American soldier had also been an educator, further complicated Margaret's attempt to maintain the dehumanized image of the enemy that had been carefully constructed by years of propaganda. Cooper reached into a nearby crate and pulled out a chocolate bar, offering it to her. "For your little girl," he said slowly. Margaret hesitated before accepting it, feeling as though she were betraying something fundamental by taking this gift from an enemy soldier. The chocolate bar was in a bright wrapper with the name Hershey's printed on it, a brand she had never seen before. Its weight in her hand felt significant, both literally and figuratively. "Danke," she said quietly, slipping the chocolate into her coat pocket. Cooper nodded and returned to his work, leaving Margaret to contemplate this interaction. The American had not demanded anything in return, had not treated her with contempt or condescension. This simple human exchange, multiplied across countless similar interactions throughout occupied Germany, would gradually erode the demonized portrayal of Americans that Nazi propaganda had worked so diligently to construct. The next revelation came when Margaret was permitted to enter the field kitchen that American forces had established in what remained of the village baker's shop. She had been recruited as one of several local women to assist with cleaning duties, a task she accepted partly out of necessity, the Americans paid in food, and partly out of growing curiosity about these foreign soldiers. The American field kitchen operated at a scale that seemed impossible, given wartime constraints. Massive containers of powdered eggs, coffee, sugar, and flour lined the walls. Refrigerated trucks delivered fresh meat and dairy products every 3 days, the amounts being prepared for just one company of approximately 170 soldiers exceeded what would have fed the entire village of Hürtgen before the war. Technical Sergeant Raymond Martinez, the mess officer, explained through a mixture of broken German and gestures that each American fighting division required approximately 12 tons of food daily. This figure seemed absolutely inconceivable to Margaret, whose school had struggled to provide even meager lunches for its students before closing due to bombing raids in early 1944. Back home, Martinez told her, through a young corporal who spoke better German, "We produce enough food to feed our entire population twice over. My family's farm in California grows more oranges than most people here will see in their lifetime." Margaret thought about the last time she had seen an orange, 1941, before they had disappeared completely from German markets. Her daughter had never tasted one. "The factory where my brother works," Martinez continued, "produced 30,000 trucks last year alone." He gestured to the military vehicles parked outside. And that's just one factory. Each such statement added to the growing realization that Germany had been fighting an industrial giant whose productive capacity dwarfed anything the Third Reich could muster. Even at its peak, the America described in Nazi propaganda, a nation weakened by depression, hamstrung by racial diversity, and corrupted by Jewish influence, bore no resemblance to the America that was evidenced by the troops and supplies now occupying Hurtgen. Perhaps the most powerful demonstration of American abundance came 2 weeks after their arrival, when the company commander authorized a Christmas celebration for the village children. Captain Robert Anderson, a 36-year-old banker from Chicago in civilian life, had requisitioned additional supplies specifically for this purpose. On the morning of December 25, 1944, the Americans transformed the damaged village church into a distribution center for food and gifts. Every child in Hurtgen under the age of 14 received a package containing chocolate, chewing gum, canned fruit, a small toy, and warm socks knitted by American civilians. The mothers received practical items, soap, coffee, sugar, and canned goods. This generosity from the supposed enemy occurred while German forces were still fighting desperately, less than 50 miles away in the last throes of the Ardennes offensive. Watching her daughter unwrap a small doll, the first new toy she had received in years, Margaret felt something break inside her. The carefully constructed worldview that had sustained her through the war years began to crumble in the face of this irrefutable evidence that everything she had been taught about Americans was false. "They told us Americans would rape our women and murder our children," whispered an elderly man standing next to her, voicing the collective cognitive dissonance. "Instead, they feed us from their abundance, while our own army cannot even supply its soldiers with winter coats." This Christmas celebration was documented by Army photographer specialist David Rosen, whose images would later become powerful tools in the denazification program. One photograph in particular captured Margaret's daughter Greta sitting on the knee of Sergeant Hendricks, both laughing as she unwrapped her gift. This image, so contrary to the Nazi portrayal of Americans as bestial enemies of the German people, would eventually be reproduced in occupation newspapers as visual evidence of the falsity of Nazi propaganda. For many in Hurtgen, including Margareta Schulz, the abundance displayed by American forces represented more than just material superiority. It demonstrated a fundamental failure of the National Socialist economic model and ideology. After years of being told that Germany possessed the most advanced economy and society in the world, the evidence of American productive capacity was undeniable and overwhelming. The revelations continued as winter progressed. In January 1945, Margaret was assigned to assist with inventory at the American Medical Station. The supplies available to just one company's medical officer exceeded what had been available to the entire village before American arrival. Penicillin, a medication virtually unknown to German civilians, was used routinely for even minor infections. When a local child developed pneumonia, the treatment provided by American medics was so effective and administered with such casual confidence that it seemed miraculous to German observers accustomed to wartime shortages. "We have warehouses full of this stuff," explained Lieutenant Howard Freeman, the company medical officer, when Margaret expressed surprise at the seemingly limitless supply of medications. "Back home, we're producing penicillin by the ton. Before I shipped out, Our pharmaceutical companies were already planning for post-war production increases. The statistics Freeman casually mentioned were staggering. American pharmaceutical production had increased by 600% since 1941. A single American factory could produce more penicillin in one day than all of Germany manufactured in a month. Medical supplies that German hospitals had been desperately rationing were treated as disposable items by American medics. By February 1945, the evidence of American industrial might had become impossible for even the most dedicated Nazi supporters in Hürtgen to ignore. Supply convoys passed through the village daily, each one carrying more materiel than most Germans had believed existed in the entire American army. Weapons, vehicles, food, clothing, medicine, the stream seemed endless. Meanwhile, news from the front indicated that German forces were increasingly undersupplied, with some units fighting without adequate ammunition or food. The abundance extended beyond military necessities to items that seemed frivolous in wartime context. American soldiers received mail from home containing cookies, candies, magazines, books, and photographs, luxuries that had disappeared from German life years earlier. They had portable radios that played music constantly, cigarettes in seemingly infinite supply, and cameras with plenty of film. Each such item represented an industrial capacity that had been systematically misrepresented by Nazi propaganda. What made this abundance particularly devastating to Nazi ideology was the fact that many of these American soldiers came from working class backgrounds, the very demographic that National Socialism had claimed to champion. Corporal Frank Dominguez, whose parents were Mexican immigrants, possessed more material wealth as a common soldier than most German middle-class families had enjoyed even before the war. Private First Class Solomon Greenberg, obviously of Jewish heritage, displayed none of the parasitic or degenerate qualities that anti-Semitic propaganda had attributed to Jews. Instead, he was a skilled mechanic who repaired the village's broken water pump, demonstrating technical expertise that benefited the entire community. The presence of Black American soldiers proved especially problematic for Nazi racial ideology. While initially segregated in support roles, by late 1944, some African American troops were serving in combat and support positions alongside white soldiers. Technical Sergeant William Johnson, an African American supply officer attached to the 28th Division, directly contradicted every aspect of the racist portrayal of blacks in Nazi propaganda. Educated, articulate, and efficient, Johnson managed the division's supply distribution with remarkable effectiveness. When he shared chocolate with German children alongside his white counterparts, the moment represented a devastating refutation of the racial hierarchy that formed the core of National Socialist ideology. The abundance displayed by American forces was not merely material. It extended to their apparent morale, confidence, and psychological resilience. Despite having fought across thousands of miles from their homeland, American troops generally displayed high spirits and certainty in their eventual victory. They spoke openly about returning home after the war, describing farms, businesses, and educational opportunities awaiting them. This future-oriented optimism contrasted sharply with the increasingly desperate fatalism that characterized German military and civilian morale by early 1945. For Margarete Schultz and many others, this psychological contrast proved as significant as the material differences. The Americans behaved like people who expected to win not just the war, but the peace that would follow, as though victory was merely a waypoint on a journey that would continue toward prosperity and normalcy. This attitude was incomprehensible to Germans who had been indoctrinated with the belief that defeat would mean the complete destruction of German culture and people. The material abundance of American forces became even more apparent as the harsh winter of 1944 to 1945 progressed. In February, when temperatures dropped to record lows, American troops received new winter gear, insulated boots, thermal underwear, heavy parkas, and waterproof gloves. Meanwhile, reports from the Eastern Front described German soldiers fighting in summer uniforms their feet wrapped in newspaper for lack of proper boots. This stark contrast, American soldiers discarding slightly worn winter gear while German troops froze, crystallized the productive disparity between the nations. "They waste more than we ever had," observed Heinrich Müller, a 72-year-old former factory worker, as he watched American supply officers distributing new cold-weather equipment. That pile of discarded jackets would outfit an entire German company, and they throw them away because the zippers are broken. Indeed, the casual waste displayed by American forces perhaps demonstrated their industrial superiority more effectively than any intentional display could have. When vehicles developed minor mechanical problems, they were often evacuated to rear areas for repair rather than being cannibalized for parts, as had become standard practice in the German military. Food that wasn't consumed within its designated freshness period was discarded rather than being preserved. Ammunition was expended liberally during training exercises, without the careful accounting that characterized German military practice. By March 1945, as American forces pressed deeper into Germany and the collapse of the Third Reich became increasingly inevitable, the psychological impact of this material disparity reached its full effect in communities like Hürtgen. Margarete Schulz, who had begun the occupation as a loyal party member, underwent a transformation that mirrored the experience of many Germans who directly encountered American troops and their overwhelming abundance. "Everything they told us was a lie," she wrote in a letter to her sister in Bavaria. "The Americans are not the barbarians we were told to fear. They have more of everything than we ever had, even before the war. Their common soldiers eat better than our officers. Their black troops are educated and well-mannered. Their Jewish soldiers share their rations with our children. How could our leaders have been so wrong about everything? And if they lied about this, what else was untrue?" This process of disillusionment accelerated as Germany approached total defeat. By April 1945, as American forces linked up with Soviet troops at the Elbe River, the contrast between the two Allied powers became yet another revelation. Soviet forces, while victorious, displayed nothing like the material abundance of their American allies. The comparative prosperity of American troops and their generally humane treatment of German civilians created a powerful incentive for German military and civilians alike to surrender to Western rather than Eastern forces. The psychological transformation experienced by Margarete Schulz and others who witnessed American abundance firsthand would play a crucial role in the post-war reconstruction of Germany. The undeniable evidence that the democratic capitalist system could produce more material prosperity than National Socialism had ever delivered, even at the height of its plunder of conquered territories, created an openness to American political and economic models that facilitated the successful implementation of the Marshall Plan and the rapid economic recovery of West Germany. The hot chocolate, shared with German children in December 1944, represented more than just a humanitarian gesture. It became a powerful symbol of the fundamental fraudulence of Nazi propaganda and the beginning of a reevaluation process that would eventually transform German society. The children who tasted American chocolate in the winter of 1944 to 1945 would come of age during the Wirtschaftswunder, economic miracle, of the 1950s, when West Germany adopted market economic principles and democratic institutions that allowed it to achieve unprecedented prosperity. The statistics tell the story of this transformation. By 1948, American aid through the Marshall Plan had delivered more than $13 billion, equivalent to approximately $150 billion in modern currency, to European reconstruction, with West Germany receiving a significant portion. German industrial production, which had fallen to approximately 30% of pre-war levels by 1945, exceeded its 1936 level by 1952 and continued to grow at an average annual rate of 8% throughout the 1950s. For Margarete Schulz personally, the encounter with American abundance led to a complete reassessment of her political beliefs and professional identity. After the war, she was initially barred from teaching due to her party membership, But the testimony of Captain Anderson regarding her assistance to American forces during the occupation helped her regain her position by 1947. When educational reforms were implemented in the American occupation zone, Margaret became an enthusiastic advocate for democratic civic education, using her own experience of ideological disillusionment as a teaching tool for a new generation of German students. "I teach my students to question everything," she wrote in 1953, "especially what seems most certain. I learned this lesson through chocolate and kindness, when everything I believed collapsed." In the face of observable reality, the American soldiers who shared their rations with German children in the winter of 1944 to 1945 could not have anticipated the long-term impact of their actions. Technical Sergeant James Hendricks returned to teaching in Pennsylvania after the war, occasionally receiving letters from German children he had encountered, including Greta Schultz. Captain Robert Anderson, who organized the Christmas distribution, later worked for the Marshall Plan administration, helping implement economic recovery programs in Bavaria. Many other American veterans maintained connections with the German communities they had occupied, creating personal bonds that transcended the former enmity. What began with the simple aroma of hot chocolate on a cold December morning in 1944 ultimately contributed to a fundamental realignment of German society. The shocking abundance displayed by American forces, from chocolate bars to medical supplies, from vehicles to weapons, provided irrefutable evidence that the closed, totalitarian economic model of National Socialism could not compete with the productive capacity of democratic capitalism. This material lesson proved more persuasive than any ideological argument could have been, demonstrating through tangible experience that the path to prosperity lay not through conquest and racial hierarchy, but through international cooperation and economic freedom. 70 years later, when interviewed for a documentary about her wartime experiences, an elderly Greta Schultz, now a retired professor of American Studies, reflected on that transformative winter. "The smell of chocolate changed the course of my life. What I witnessed as a child was the collapse of one world and the birth of another." The Americans didn't just bring supplies, they brought a different vision of what was possible. "My mother always said that more minds were changed by American chocolate than by American bullets. The abundance they displayed so casually destroyed the foundation of everything we had been taught to believe." The story of Hurtgen's encounter with American abundance was repeated thousands of times across occupied Germany, as civilians who had been systematically misinformed about their enemies came face to face with the reality of American productive capacity and the generally humane behavior of occupation forces. This widespread experience created the psychological conditions necessary for Germany's successful post-war reconstruction and integration into the Western democratic community of nations. The irony was profound. The hot chocolate that German children eagerly consumed in the winter of 1944 to 1945 represented the final defeat not just of the Nazi regime, but of the entire ideological system it had constructed. A worldview built on notions of racial superiority and militant nationalism collapsed in the face of something as simple as the casual abundance of chocolate in the hands of the supposed enemy. In that sweet aroma lay the seeds of Germany's future transformation, from the ruins of the Third Reich to the prosperity of the Federal Republic. When Margaret Schultz followed the scent of chocolate on that December morning, she could not have known she was taking the first steps on a journey that would lead her from ideological certainty to a profound re-evaluation of everything she had been taught to believe. The collapse of her Nazi worldview began not with philosophical arguments or moral condemnations, but with the simple, undeniable evidence of American abundance freely shared with German children. No propaganda could withstand the reality of that generosity, and no ideological construct could survive the mounting evidence of its fundamental falsity. 75 years after that winter of revelation, the legacy of those encounters continues to shape German-American relations. The Marshall Plan is remembered not just as an economic program, but as a psychological turning point that demonstrated an alternative to the failed promises of totalitarianism. The Wirtschaftswunder that transformed Germany from the devastation of defeat to one of the world's leading economies stands as testament to the power of those early encounters with American abundance. The sweet smell of hot chocolate drifting through the bitter winter air of occupied Germany ultimately proved more powerful than the hateful rhetoric that had dominated for 12 years. In that simple human gesture, enemy soldiers sharing their rations with hungry children lay the seeds of reconciliation and reconstruction that would allow former adversaries to become allies and partners in building a more prosperous future. What began with chocolate ended with one of history's most successful national transformations, from the ruins of totalitarian defeat to the prosperity of democratic renewal. December 7, 1944. The air hung heavy with the scent of gunpowder and jungle rot as Lieutenant James Caldwell of the 77th Infantry Division pushed through the dense undergrowth of northern Leyte in the Philippines. 3 days of fierce fighting had left the 27-year-old officer from Portland, Oregon, exhausted, but the Japanese retreat had been swift, abandoning their forward position with unusual haste. As his unit secured what appeared to be a small compound of wooden structures, the lieutenant's attention was drawn to the sound of hushed whimpering coming from a padlocked outbuilding. When his men broke through the rusted lock, what they discovered defied 18 years of military intelligence briefings on Japanese imperial forces. Huddled in the dim light were 23 young women, not Japanese soldiers, not military personnel of any kind, but civilians with hollow eyes and bruised bodies. Most were Korean, though a few were Filipino and Chinese, ranging in age from 16 to 30. They were malnourished, terrified, and displayed signs of prolonged abuse. Lieutenant Caldwell's unit had stumbled upon one of Imperial Japan's most closely guarded atrocities, a comfort station, where women were systematically raped to maintain military morale. As Caldwell would later write in his field report, what we witnessed was not an army, but a criminal enterprise. These women looked at us not as enemy combatants, but as potential saviors. The smallest act of kindness, offering a canteen of water, a K-ration, brought them to tears. What they had endured made our combat experiences pale in comparison. They had been fighting a war without weapons, without uniforms, without recognition, and without hope. The existence of these comfort women represented one of the most disturbing chapters of World War II, one that would remain largely hidden from public awareness for decades after the conflict ended. While Allied forces had received scattered intelligence reports suggesting the Japanese military maintained brothels, the systematic scale and brutality of the comfort women system exceeded even the darkest assessments. Intelligence estimates from 1945 would later suggest that between 50,000 and 200,000 women were enslaved in this system across Asia and the Pacific. The majority came from Korea, which had been under Japanese colonial rule since 1910. The Japanese government had established this system under the belief that regulated prostitution would reduce the incidence of random sexual violence against local populations and limit the spread of venereal diseases among troops. However, what began as a misguided military policy evolved into one of the most extensive systems of sexual slavery in modern history. The journey to these comfort stations began for most Korean women with deception. Japanese recruiters, often working with Korean collaborators, promised young women legitimate employment as factory workers, nurses, or laundresses, supporting the Japanese war effort. The economic hardships of colonial Korea made these offers attractive to impoverished families. Girls as young as 14 were told they would be serving their country, earning good wages, and supporting their families. Only after being transported to distant locations did they discover the horrifying truth. Upon arrival, they were stripped of their identity documents, given Japanese names, and forced to service between 10 and 30 soldiers daily. Any resistance was met with brutal beatings, torture, or execution. The Japanese military maintained detailed regulations for these comfort stations, including schedules, fee structures, and health protocols. The women themselves were considered military supplies, no different from ammunition or fuel in the eyes of their captors. By 1944, the Japanese comfort station system had expanded to every territory under Japanese occupation. The military had systematized the process so thoroughly that comfort stations were established immediately following new conquests. As American and Allied forces began pushing back Japanese lines in the Pacific Theater, they increasingly encountered these facilities, though many officers initially misunderstood what they had discovered. Military intelligence was slow to recognize the difference between voluntary prostitution, which existed around military bases of all nations, and the systematic sexual slavery practiced by the Japanese imperial forces. This failure of intelligence reflected both cultural blind spots and the compartmentalization of military knowledge. American soldiers in the field, however, quickly grasped the reality when faced with the physical condition of the women they liberated. The contrast between Japanese propaganda and reality could not have been more stark. Japanese colonial authorities had spent decades portraying their empire as a civilizing force in Asia, bringing modernization, education, and order to what they characterized as backward regions. Colonial school children in Korea were taught that Japan was their benefactor, bringing enlightenment and progress. The reality of Japan's Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere was revealed most nakedly in the comfort women system, where colonial subjects were reduced to sexual slavery to maintain the imperial project. For the women themselves, raised in the conservative Confucian traditions of Korea, where female chastity was highly valued, the shame of their experience often proved as devastating as the physical abuse. Many would later report that they had expected to die in these comfort stations, having lost all hope of rescue or return to their families. For the American forces fighting across the Pacific, the discovery of comfort women's stations provided a jarring counterpoint to their own understanding of the conflict. While American wartime propaganda had portrayed the Japanese enemy as brutal, the specific nature of this brutality, systematized sexual slavery on an industrial scale, fell outside even the most negative characterizations. Captain Richard Hennessy of Military Intelligence, who interviewed dozens of former comfort women in the Philippines, wrote in February 1945, "These women have endured a form of torture that has no parallel in modern warfare. Their testimony reveals not random acts of violence, but an institutionalized system of abuse sanctioned at the highest levels of the Japanese military. The psychological warfare being conducted against these women is as sophisticated as any battlefield. Strategy. The first comprehensive American report on the comfort women's system was compiled by Lieutenant Colonel James M. Watson of the Judge Advocate, General's Corps in January 1945. His 200-page assessment, classified top secret until 1976, documented testimonies from 87 former comfort women and 32 Japanese personnel involved in managing the system. The report estimated that each Japanese division maintained at least one comfort station with 20 to 30 women. With approximately 50 active Japanese divisions in 1944, this suggested a minimum of 1,000 comfort stations operating across Japanese-occupied territories. Watson's report concluded, "The comfort women's system represents not a battlefield excess, but a carefully designed component of Japanese military operations. The level of administrative detail, medical examinations, payment systems, facility regulations indicates full institutional knowledge and approval at command levels." The journey of discovery for American forces began in earnest with the Philippines campaign of 1944. As General MacArthur fulfilled his promise to return to the Philippines, American troops advanced rapidly across islands that had been under Japanese occupation for nearly 3 years. On Leyte, Samar, and later Luzon, they discovered dozens of comfort stations, often abandoned as Japanese forces retreated but sometimes still operational when American units arrived. Master Sergeant Thomas Wilkins of the 37th Infantry Division described his unit's discovery near San Fernando, Pampanga Province. We thought it was a field hospital at first, given the number of beds and the presence of rudimentary medical supplies. It was only when we found the ledgers with Japanese characters and columns of numbers that we realized this was something else entirely. The local villagers were initially reluctant to explain, but finally an elderly man told us through our interpreter that this had been a place where slave women were kept for Japanese officers. He pointed to a small cemetery behind the facility where he claimed women who had died from disease or mistreatment were buried. We excavated one grave and found the remains of a young woman approximately 20 years old. Our medical officer confirmed signs of malnutrition and healed fractures consistent with physical abuse. The testimonies of the women themselves provided the most compelling evidence. Kim Suno-ke, a 22-year-old Korean woman rescued from a comfort station in the mountains of northern Luzon in March 1945, described her ordeal to Army Nurse Lieutenant Sarah Jacobson. "I was 18 when they came to my village near Busan. A Korean man working for the Japanese told my father I would work in a factory making uniforms and could send money home. My family needed the money because the Japanese had taken our rice harvests. After 3 days of travel by train and ship, we arrived in Manila. They took all our clothes and gave us kimonos. The Japanese officer told us we would serve the Imperial Army as comfort women. I did not understand until that night when the first soldier came. When I resisted, they beat me unconscious. After that, I stopped fighting. Each day I would serve 10 to 15 men. If we became pregnant, they gave us injections to cause miscarriages. Many girls tried to kill themselves. I thought about it many times, but I wanted to survive to see my family again. I prayed someone would save us, but after 3 years, I stopped praying." Lee Mija, a 20-year-old woman from Pyongyang, provided testimony to Army psychiatrist Captain David Rothstein that revealed the sophisticated psychological manipulation employed in the comfort system. "Before I was taken, I had never left my village. I had never seen electric lights or modern buildings. When we arrived in Shanghai, everything was overwhelming. Tall buildings, bright lights, so many people. The Japanese officers first took us to a hotel, gave us new clothes and good food. They told us we would work in places like this, serving important people. For 3 days they treated us well. Then they put us on another ship. When we arrived at the military base, everything changed. They stripped us, examined us like animals, and locked us in small rooms. Those first days of kindness were the cruelest deception. They showed us a glimpse of a better life before condemning us to hell. Later, I learned this was their standard procedure. They called it conditioning. For years afterward, I could not trust kindness. Even now, when someone is nice to me, I wait for the moment when they will reveal their true cruelty." Park Jong-suk, another Korean survivor found at a comfort station near Clark Airfield in January 1945, provided testimony that was included in Army intelligence briefings. The Japanese military managed everything like a business. Each soldier paid with tickets they purchased from their superiors. Different ranks paid different amounts. Officers could stay longer than enlisted men. We were examined by a doctor every week, and if anyone had disease, they were injected with something called number 606 that made them very sick. They kept detailed records of everything: how many men each woman served, how much money was collected, which soldiers visited, which women. If the military police thought a woman was hiding money or planning to escape, the punishment was severe. I saw 3 women executed for attempting to escape. They gathered all of us to watch so we would not try the same. Choi Sun-hee, a former school teacher from Seoul who spent 2 years in a comfort station on Luzon, detailed the bureaucratic precision of her captivity in testimony. Given to American intelligence officers, each woman had a ledger with her name, not her real name, but her Japanese name, and each day was marked with numbers. The minimum quota was 15 men per day. If we failed to meet this quota for any reason, illness, menstruation, exhaustion, we were punished with reduced food rations or beatings. If we exceeded the quota, we received no benefit. On Saturdays, Japanese officers would come to review the ledgers, calculating profits and losses, as if we were a factory producing goods. They would discuss us in front of us, commenting on which women were becoming less popular or which were developing health problems that might reduce their value. Once a month, a military accountant would come to calculate the station's contribution to the war effort. They had a term for us, mobile military supplies, and they calculated our value in terms of soldier morale and combat effectiveness. One officer told the station manager that each comfort woman was worth 20 rifles in terms of military value. American medical personnel were often the first to comprehend the magnitude of abuse suffered by these women. Captain Eleanor Johnson, a physician with the 41st Evacuation Hospital, treated 36 former comfort women recovered from various locations in the Philippines. Her clinical notes, preserved in the National Archives, document the physical consequences of their captivity. Subject A. Korean female, age approximately 23, exhibits signs of chronic malnutrition, vitamin deficiencies, particularly B complex and C, resulting in dermatological manifestations and dental deterioration. Pelvic examination reveals significant trauma consistent with repeated sexual assault. Scarring on back and thighs consistent with cigarette burns and whipping. Blood tests positive for syphilis, despite subject reporting regular treatments during captivity. Psychological state shows classic trauma response, dissociation, extreme startle response, nightmares, and inability to make eye contact during examination. Lieutenant Commander Robert Hayes, a Navy physician assigned to evaluate former comfort women on Guam, documented the sophisticated but brutal medical regimen imposed on the women. The Japanese military implemented a regular word prophylaxis program designed not for the women's health, but to maintain them as disease-free vessels for the troops. Weekly examinations were conducted using unsterilized instruments, often causing infections. Venereal diseases were treated with arsenic compounds that caused severe side effects, including liver damage and neurological symptoms. Pregnancy was prevented through various means. Some women report being forced to drink herbal concoctions that induced bleeding. Others describe injections that caused violent illness and miscarriage. Several subjects display evidence of traumatic abortions performed without anesthesia. Most disturbing are signs of experimental medical procedures. Subjects C, F, and K exhibit surgical scars consistent with gynecological experimentation rather than therapeutic intervention. Subject C reports being part of a group of 6 women used by military doctors to practice surgery while conscious but restrained. The discovery extended beyond the Philippines. As American forces advanced through the Pacific, similar facilities were uncovered in Guam, Okinawa, and eventually mainland Japan itself. Technical Sergeant Robert Miyamoto, a Nisei, second-generation Japanese-American translator with the Military Intelligence Service, interviewed former comfort women and Japanese personnel at 3 different sites. His unique cultural and linguistic position allowed him insights other American personnel lacked. In his report, dated August 12, 1945, he wrote, "The Japanese personnel I interviewed displayed no moral compunction about the comfort women's system. They viewed it as a necessary logistical arrangement, comparing it to food service or ammunition supply. When I asked one Japanese warrant officer if he understood these women had been coerced, he expressed surprise at the question, stating, 'Of course they were. Who would do this willingly?' The disconnect between Japanese claims of bringing civilization to Asia and their treatment of Asian women as disposable commodities for military use represents the fundamental hypocrisy of the entire Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere concept." Lieutenant John Dashwood, an intelligence officer who specialized in Japanese military organization, uncovered documentation revealing how central the comfort women system was to Japanese military planning. Each division had a designated officer responsible for special comfort facilities. This position ranked equivalent to officers managing artillery or supply chains. It was not a peripheral function, but a core military responsibility. Planning documents captured near Manila reveal that comfort stations were included in the initial deployment strategy for any new territory. Within 72 hours of securing an area, 3 facilities were to be established: a command post, a supply depot, and a comfort station. The documented reasoning stated, military effectiveness depends on morale. Morale depends on rest and recreation. Proper rest and recreation requires regulated comfort facilities. The women were categorized by nationality, with Japanese women reserved for officers, Korean women for non-commissioned officers, and local women for enlisted personnel. Prices were set according to this racial hierarchy, with visits to Japanese women costing 5 times more than visits to local women. Korean women occupied the middle tier in this grotesque pricing structure. For many American soldiers, the discovery of comfort women's stations forced a reconceptualization of the enemy they were fighting. Private First Class Daniel Cooper, a 20-year-old from Nebraska serving with the 7th Infantry Division, wrote home after his unit liberated a comfort station on Okinawa, "I cannot describe in a letter what we found here. It would never pass the censors, and Mother should not read such things anyway. I will only say that I understand now why we are fighting. Before, it was about Pearl Harbor and defending America. Now I see we are fighting for these women too, women who have suffered things I didn't know one human could do to another. The enemy is not just another army. It is a way of thinking that says some people aren't people at all." Corporal James Wilson of the Marine Corps, who participated in the liberation of a comfort station on Saipan, recorded in his journal, "Today, I met the enemy in a way no training prepared me for. We secured what looked like a small hospital behind Japanese lines. Inside were 13 women, Koreans, our interpreter said, who had been kept as sex slaves for the Japanese troops. The oldest couldn't have been more than 25, the youngest maybe 16. They were afraid of us at first, hiding in corners when we entered the building. Our corpsman examined them and said they showed signs of repeated abuse, malnutrition, and disease. One girl had cigarette burns all over her body. Another had whip scars on her back. I've been in combat for 8 months now, seen men blown apart by mortars, held friends as they died. Nothing prepared me for the kind of calculated cruelty I saw today." This wasn't the chaos of battle. It was systematic torture disguised as military necessity. When I joined up after Pearl Harbor, I thought I knew what we were fighting for: America, freedom, stopping Jap aggression. Now I know we're also fighting against a kind of evil I never imagined existed. No matter what happens to me, I will never regret being part of the force that freed those women. The overwhelming evidence of the comfort women's system's brutality emerged not just from witness testimony, but from Japanese military documentation captured during advances. The Imperial Japanese Army, with its emphasis on hierarchy and record-keeping, maintained detailed regulations for comfort stations. American intelligence officers discovered military directives concerning the recruitment of comfort women, their transportation, health management, and even calculation of their economic value. A document recovered from a Japanese headquarters in Manila outlined the Comfort Division budget, assigning monetary values to each woman based on age, appearance, and nationality. With Korean women valued lower than Japanese but higher than Filipino or Chinese women, the document calculated the expected service life of a comfort woman at 2 years, after which they were considered depreciated assets. A particularly disturbing document discovered by intelligence officers at a headquarters in Singapore was a training manual for comfort station managers. The 60-page document, translated by Lieutenant Eric Yamamoto, a Japanese-American linguist, provided detailed instructions on everything from breaking in new women to maintaining them for maximum use. The manual included sections on psychological conditioning, advising new women will resist their duties and may attempt suicide. This resistance must be broken immediately through a combination of physical punishment and psychological manipulation. Isolation, sleep deprivation, and selective rewarding of compliant behavior will typically achieve results within 2 weeks. Any woman who remains defiant after this period should be publicly punished to serve as an example to others. The document included guidance on optimizing the number of soldiers each woman could service, recommended restraint techniques for difficult subjects, and calculation methods for determining when a woman should be considered expended and replaced. Lieutenant Colonel Samuel Harrison, who oversaw the collection and analysis of captured Japanese documents related to the Comfort Women system, wrote in his summary report, "What distinguishes this atrocity from other wartime brutalities is not just its scope, but its bureaucratic nature. These were not crimes of passion or opportunity, but planned, regulated, and documented actions approved at the highest levels of military command. The precision of record-keeping, medical examination schedules, profit and loss statements, efficiency reports measuring women's productivity reveals a system that had normalized the unthinkable. When military planners can discuss human beings in the same terminology used for ammunition stockpiles or fuel reserves, a profound moral boundary has been crossed. The scale of the system became apparent as liberation continued. Major William Peterson of the Counterintelligence Corps compiled statistical analyses based on captured documents and interviews with Japanese prisoners. His report, submitted to the Supreme Commander of the Allied Powers in September 1945, estimated that the Japanese military had transported between 80,000 and 100,000 Korean women to comfort stations throughout their conquered territories. He calculated that each comfort woman was forced to serve an average of 15 men daily, meaning that, by conservative estimates, these women were raped more than 400 million times during the course of the war. "Whoa, the industrial scale of this sexual slavery," Peterson wrote, "exceeds anything previously documented in modern warfare. The level of organizational effort devoted to maintaining this system, transportation networks, medical protocols, facility construction, security arrangements demonstrates that this was not an accidental byproduct of war, but a central component of Japanese military operations." Captain Harold Mitchell, an intelligence officer specialized in logistics analysis, examined the transportation records of the Japanese military and found that ships carrying comfort women were given priority similar to those carrying ammunition and fuel. His report noted, in November 1943, when Japanese forces were already facing critical supply shortages across the Pacific Theater, a transport carrying 248 Korean women to comfort stations in the Philippines was given naval escort typically reserved for high-value military cargo. During the same period, medical supplies for civilian hospitals in occupied territories were delayed or canceled. This prioritization reveals how essential the Comfort Women system was considered to Japanese military operations. The Imperial Army was willing to divert resources from tactical necessities to maintain this system of sexual slavery, even as their strategic position deteriorated. Technical Sergeant Howard Williams, part of a document translation team, discovered comfort station regulations at an abandoned Japanese headquarters in Luzon. The 40-page manual detailed every aspect of operations, from architecture specifications, room size, wall thickness for sound containment, ventilation requirements, to administrative procedures, fee collection, record-keeping templates, prophylactic distribution. Most disturbing were sections concerning discipline and control, which outlined punishments for women who failed to serve enough soldiers daily, attempted to keep gifts from soldiers, or showed signs of emotional distress that disrupted military morale. Williams would later testify at the Tokyo War Crimes trials that these documents proved command-level knowledge and approval of the system. This was not something created by individual units acting on their own. The standardization across different geographical areas, the consistent administrative procedures, and the official letterhead on directives all indicate central planning and authorization. First Lieutenant Melissa Thornton, a Women's Army Corps officer assigned to assist with the care and repatriation of former comfort women, documented the economic exploitation built into the system. The women were theoretically paid for their services, but this payment existed primarily on paper. According to testimony and captured documents, women accumulated debt from the moment of their recruitment, charges for transportation, food, clothing, medical care, and even the cost of the condoms they were forced to use. These debts were inflated to ensure the women could never pay them off. One ledger I examined showed a Korean woman who had been in captivity for 2 years. Despite being forced to service over 10,000 men during this period, her debt had increased rather than decreased. This debt bondage created a financial justification for what was, in reality, sexual slavery. When American forces liberated comfort stations, many women reported they had never received a single payment during years of captivity. Photographic evidence, though limited due to the sensitive nature of the discoveries, provided irrefutable documentation. Take up one. Military photographer Sergeant James Baldwin captured images of a comfort station near San Pablo in the Philippines immediately after its liberation. His photographs show a compound surrounded by barbed wire, small divided rooms containing only straw mats and buckets, and a crude medical examination room with gynecological equipment. Most compelling were images of the women themselves, still wearing the Japanese kimonos they had been forced to wear, with visible bruises, malnourishment, and thousand-yard stares that Baldwin described as the eyes of prisoners who had given up hope of ever being free again. These photographs, initially classified, would later become crucial evidence when comfort women began seeking recognition and justice in the 1990s. Baldwin's photographs revealed another disturbing aspect of the comfort stations, their physical resemblance to concentration camps. In his notes accompanying the images, he wrote, "The architectural similarities between these facilities and prisoner-of-war camps are striking. Guard towers, barbed wire, isolation from local populations, sparse accommodations designed for control rather than comfort. The difference is that POW camps, however brutal, operate under at least the pretense of international law. These comfort stations exist in a legal void, their victims unacknowledged by any protective convention. While POWs might expect eventual liberation or exchange, these women were effectively sentenced to disappear from history." The technological superiority of American forces compared to the conditions in which comfort women were kept created another stark contrast. Lieutenant Mark Davidson, a supply officer with the 96th Infantry Division, wrote in his journal, "We bring these women K rations, and they react as if we've given them a feast. Our ordinary soldiers' food, the powdered eggs, the canned meat, the chocolate bars we sometimes complain about, seems like luxury to them." One Korean woman who told us she had been a teacher before being taken asked if she could keep an empty ration tin because it was the first metal container she had owned in 3 years. Meanwhile, our division moves with trucks, jeeps, bulldozers, and field kitchens. The technological gap between us and the Japanese forces is significant, but the gap between our treatment of people and theirs is infinite. Captain Benjamin Richards, a quartermaster officer responsible for distributing supplies to liberated comfort women in Okinawa, noted in his report, "The contrast between our military's material abundance and these women's deprivation defies description. In the same week that our unit discarded 12 crates of excess chocolate bars because they had begun to melt in the heat, we discovered women who had been surviving on rice gruel so meager that many showed signs of beriberi and pellagra. One woman wept when given a new cotton dress, explaining she had worn the same tattered clothes for 18 months. Another could not comprehend that she was being offered an entire bar of soap for her personal use, as she had been allowed only communal access to a small soap piece once weekly for bathing. When I attempted to explain that every American soldier received 2 uniform changes, regular hot meals, medical care, and even recreational supplies as standard issue, they looked at me with disbelief. The notion that ordinary soldiers would receive such treatment contradicted everything they had been told about military life. The testimony of Japanese prisoners provided additional confirmation. Staff Sergeant Thomas Eakins, an interrogator with the Allied translator and interpreter section, interviewed dozens of Japanese soldiers concerning comfort stations. He noted a striking difference between lower-ranking soldiers and officers in their attitudes. Enlisted men often expressed a combination of utilization and pity, Eakins reported. They would describe visiting comfort stations as a routine part of military life, something expected and encouraged by their superiors, while simultaneously acknowledging the women's suffering. Officers, by contrast, described the system in purely pragmatic terms, a necessary facility for maintaining troop morale and preventing rape of local civilians. When pressed about the women's consent, one Japanese captain stated, "Consent is irrelevant in war. These women serve the emperor just as soldiers do. Their sacrifice was necessary for victory." Lieutenant Christopher Tanaka, another Nisei translator, documented the psychological compartmentalization that allowed Japanese soldiers to participate in the system. When questioned about their visits to comfort stations, many Japanese prisoners displayed a striking cognitive dissonance. They would speak of specific comfort women they had relationships with, describing bringing small gifts or treats as if these were romantic connections rather than encounters with enslaved women. When confronted with the coercive nature of these interactions, many appeared genuinely confused, as if this perspective had never occurred to them. One sergeant described writing letters home to his wife and mother while sitting outside a comfort station waiting for his turn. When I asked how he reconciled these two aspects of his life, he seemed puzzled by the question. The military had so thoroughly normalized the comfort women system that many soldiers had lost the ability to recognize its fundamental immorality. This normalization of atrocity represents perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire system. Physical evidence at the comfort stations themselves told a story of systematic imprisonment and abuse. Lieutenant Sophia Daniels, a military intelligence officer assigned to document comfort stations on Okinawa, provided this description. The typical facility contains barrack-style buildings divided into small cubicles approximately 6 feet by 4 feet. Each cubicle contains a single mat, a small wash basin, and often a crude wooden board on which Japanese soldiers would write their names or units. Some cubicles contain tallies apparently recording the number of men served. Security measures include barbed wire, guard posts, and in many cases, primitive alarm systems using tin cans on strings attached to doors and windows. Medical rooms contain examination tables, speculum, and supplies of mercury compounds used to treat venereal diseases. In multiple locations, we discovered hidden spaces beneath floorboards or behind walls where women had concealed small personal items, photographs of family members, letters never sent, even homemade dolls crafted from scraps of cloth. These hidden treasures represent the only expressions of individuality and hope in environments designed to dehumanize. Captain Walter Stevens, a civil engineer assigned to assess captured Japanese facilities, noted the architectural design of comfort stations reflected their purpose. These structures were designed with surveillance and control as primary considerations. Living quarters for the women typically had no windows or only small barred openings placed too high to see through. Internal corridors were arranged to prevent women from communicating between rooms. Many stations featured a central guard room, positioned to monitor all movement. The construction quality varied dramatically between staff areas and women's quarters, the former built with proper insulation and ventilation, the latter often little more than wooden cells with inadequate protection from elements. One facility on Luzon exemplified this contrast. The station manager's office contained electric fans, a proper desk, and filing cabinets, while 30 women were housed in an uninsulated barracks with a dirt floor that flooded during rainstorms. The architecture itself tells the story of dehumanization. These were buildings designed to contain livestock, not house human beings. The psychological transformation of both the liberated women and their American liberators constituted a profound aspect of these encounters. For the women, initial liberation often triggered not joy, but terror. Having been told by their Japanese captors that American soldiers would torture and kill them, many hid or attempted to flee when U.S. forces arrived. Lieutenant Rebecca Martinez, a nurse with the 325th Station Hospital, described the first 24 hours after liberating a comfort station near Davao. The women would not come near male soldiers regardless of how gently they approached. They huddled together in corners, trembling uncontrollably when anyone in uniform came near. We brought in Filipino civilians to translate, explaining that they were free and would not be harmed. It took nearly 2 days before they would accept food directly from our hands. One Korean woman, who spoke some English, finally explained that the Japanese had told them Americans would put them on display in cages and then execute them for bringing dishonor to their countries. When we showed them they could move freely, that the gates were open, several broke down in tears. It was as if they had forgotten what freedom meant. The process of psychological reorientation required patience and specialized approaches. Major Elizabeth Collins, a psychiatric nurse assigned to work with liberated comfort women on Okinawa, documented the techniques that proved most effective. These women had experienced such profound betrayal that conventional approaches to building trust were ineffective. We discovered that predictability and consistency were essential first steps. Maintaining the same personnel, establishing regular meal times, and creating daily routines that the women could anticipate without fear. We avoided asking direct questions about their experiences, instead focusing on immediate needs and gradually introducing choices: what food they preferred, what time they wished to bathe, what activities they might enjoy. For women who had been denied all agency, the ability to make even small decisions represented a crucial step toward reclaiming their humanity. Physical healing often preceded psychological healing. Only after adequate nutrition, medical treatment, and rest did many women begin to express emotions beyond fear and resignation. The first spontaneous smile from a survivor became a milestone we celebrated as a medical team, a sign that recovery, however long and difficult, was possible. For American military personnel, these encounters often produced a profound sense of moral purpose that transcended conventional warfare objectives. Captain William Henshaw, a chaplain with the 7th Infantry Division, wrote, "I have seen hardened combat veterans, men who had endured the worst battles of this Pacific campaign, brought to tears by the condition of these women. Soldiers who hours earlier had been engaged in killing Japanese troops now gently offered their rations, jackets, and medical supplies to these survivors. Many told me afterward that while they had understood intellectually why America was fighting, these encounters gave them a visceral moral certainty about our cause that no propaganda film or patriotic speech ever could. As one sergeant put it, 'Chaplain, I now know exactly what we're fighting against, and it's evil itself.'" Sergeant Michael O'Brien, a combat veteran who participated in the liberation of a comfort station on Leyte, described his unit's transformation. "We'd been fighting for months, seeing friends die, becoming hardened to violence and suffering. Then we found these women, and something changed in all of us. Guys who normally joked about everything fell silent. Our medic, who had seen the worst battlefield injuries without flinching, had to step outside after examining the first 3 women. That night, I saw our toughest staff sergeant, a man who never showed emotion, sitting alone cleaning his rifle with tears streaming down his face. The next day, without orders, the men began taking turns standing guard outside the building where the women were recovering, bringing them extra rations from their own supplies, rigging up privacy screens for bathing. These small acts of humanity seemed to restore something in us that the war had taken away. We remembered why decency matters, why the difference between us and the enemy isn't just which side we're fighting for, but how we see the worth of every human being. The psychological impact on the women manifested in complex ways. Dr. Helen Morrison, a psychiatrist assigned to evaluate former comfort women for potential testimony at war crimes trials, documented patterns of trauma that exceeded her previous clinical experience. These women exhibit psychological injuries I have not encountered even among the most severely shell-shocked combat veterans. Many display a phenomenon I can only describe as identity erasure. They have been so thoroughly conditioned to view themselves as objects rather than persons that they struggle to express preferences, make choices, or imagine a future. When asked simple questions like what food they prefer or what they might want to do the following day, many become distressed, looking for guidance or permission before answering. They have been systematically trained to exist only in response to others' demands. Dr. Morrison's clinical observations documented the progressive stages of recovery among survivors. The journey back to selfhood follows a pattern I have now observed across dozens of cases. Initially, women exhibit what I term permission-seeking behavior, unable to take even the smallest action without explicit approval. This gradually transitions to mirroring behavior, where they carefully observe and imitate others to determine appropriate responses. The breakthrough moment typically comes with the first expressed preference, often around food or clothing, offered without prompting or permission. This seemingly small assertion represents an enormous psychological victory. The next crucial stage involves reclaiming their birth names, often accompanied by intense emotional release. Many women weep uncontrollably the first time they hear themselves addressed by their real names after years of responding to Japanese designations. Recovery advances through reclaiming personal narrative, being able to speak about their experiences as something that happened to them rather than something that defines them entirely. The final stage, reached by too few during my observation period, involves imagining a future, expressing hopes, plans, or wishes extending beyond immediate survival needs. The testimonies of the comfort women themselves revealed the profound psychological journey from enslavement to freedom. Kim Hak-soon, a Korean woman liberated from a comfort station in the Philippines, later recounted, "When the American soldiers found us, I did not believe we were truly being rescued. The Japanese had told us the white soldiers would kill us or use us worse than they had. The first American I saw was a tall man who offered me a chocolate bar. I was afraid to take it, afraid it was a trick. When I finally took it, my hands were shaking so badly I dropped it. He picked it up, unwrapped it, and broke off a piece, eating it himself before offering it again. This simple act, showing it was safe, treating me as a person who deserved consideration, was when I first felt human again. I had been a thing, a comfort bag, as the Japanese called us, for so long that I had forgotten I was a person. It took many months before I could sleep through the night or speak above a whisper. Even now, 40 years later, I startle at loud noises and cannot bear to be in small, enclosed spaces. The transformation extended to cultural perceptions as well. Many Korean women had been indoctrinated with Japanese colonial propaganda portraying Americans as devils and savages. Park Soon-yi, interviewed in 1985 by a Korean newspaper, recalled, "The Japanese told us Americans had horns like devils and would eat our flesh. When I saw my first American soldier, a young medic who treated the infections on my arms, I touched his head looking for horns. He thought I was checking for lice and laughed, showing me his medical kit with its picture of his family. He was someone's son, just like the son I might have had if my life had been different." This realization that our enemies were human and our supposed protectors had been monsters turned everything I had been taught upside down. It was like learning the world spins in the opposite direction than you had always believed. Hong Chun-ja, who spent 3 years in a comfort station in the Dutch East Indies before being liberated by Australian forces working with Americans, described her cognitive struggle. "The Japanese taught us they were bringing Asian prosperity, freeing us from Western colonizers. They said Japanese and Koreans were one family under the emperor, that we were contributing to a sacred cause. Then white soldiers came, and instead of killing us as the Japanese warned, they gave us medicine, food, and respect. One Australian nurse spent hours removing lice from my hair, speaking gently, though I couldn't understand her words. An American doctor treated the infections on my legs without demanding anything in return. A Filipino translator told me I could go home eventually, that the war would end soon. I didn't know what to believe anymore. Everything was reversed. Our Asian brothers had enslaved us, and our Western enemies were setting us free. For months, I couldn't trust anyone. I kept waiting for the Americans to show their true nature, to hurt us as the Japanese had. It took a long time to accept that sometimes liberation comes from unexpected directions, that the stories we are told about who is good and who is evil can be complete lies. For many women, The return to their home societies proved almost as traumatic as their captivity. Lieutenant James Wilson, a civil affairs officer responsible for repatriating former comfort women to Korea in 1946, documented the challenges. These women faced impossible choices. Many feared returning to families who would reject them due to cultural emphasis on female purity. Others worried their communities would view them as Japanese collaborators rather than victims. Some had become pregnant despite the crude birth control methods forced upon them, and now had mixed-race children. We established a processing center in Seoul where women could receive medical treatment, psychological counseling, and vocational training before deciding whether to make their identities known to families. Of 217 Korean comfort women processed through our center, only 43 initially chose to contact their families. The majority chose to create new identities in different regions, carrying their trauma in silence. The cultural stigma that awaited returning comfort women represented a second victimization. Captain Julia Martinez, a social worker assigned to the repatriation program, documented this phenomenon. The cruelest irony these women face is that their greatest suffering becomes their greatest shame. In traditional Korean society, female chastity is valued above almost all other qualities. Women who have been sexually violated, regardless of circumstances, face ostracism, rejection by potential husbands, and lifelong stigma. I interviewed a woman who had been abducted at 15 and spent 3 years in a comfort station in China. Upon repatriation, she returned to her village only to have her parents tell neighbors she had died rather than acknowledge what had happened to her. Another woman was accepted back by her husband, only to be treated as a servant rather than a wife, forbidden from touching their children because she was considered unclean. These cultural responses compounded the original trauma, forcing most women to hide their experiences. The Japanese military had calculated this cultural dynamic perfectly. They chose victims from conservative societies where rape victims would be blamed rather than supported, ensuring that many survivors would never speak of their experiences. The formation of survivor communities represented a crucial aspect of psychological recovery. In several locations, particularly Manila and Seoul, former comfort women created informal support networks. Corporal Michael Chen, a Chinese-American civil affairs officer, described one such community in Manila. Approximately 30 former comfort women, mostly Korean with a few Chinese and Filipinas, established what they called a sister's house in a building provided by Catholic charities. They pooled their modest compensation from the U.S. military and established a laundry business. More important than the economic activity was the psychological support they provided each other. They understood one another's nightmares, triggers, and shame in ways no outsider, however well-intentioned, could. Many American personnel, particularly female nurses and Women's Army Corps members, maintained contact with this community for years after the official occupation ended, sending supplies and letters of support. These survivor communities often developed unique cultural expressions to process their experiences. Lieutenant Sarah Peterson, an anthropologist assigned to document cultural aspects of the occupation, observed the women in the Manila Recovery Center developed a form of communal storytelling that served therapeutic purposes. Each evening, they would gather to share not their trauma, which remained largely unspoken, but stories from their childhoods, folk tales from their home regions, and hopes for the future. These stories were told in a mixture of Korean, Japanese, and newly learned English, creating a unique linguistic space that reflected their transnational experience. They also developed specific rituals around meals, bathing, and sleeping arrangements that established new forms of security and community. Most striking was a ceremony they conducted monthly for women who had died in the comfort stations, combining elements of Korean shamanic tradition with Christian prayer learned from their American caregivers. Through these cultural innovations, they began creating a shared identity based not just on victimization, but on survival and mutual support. The transformation of American perceptions was equally profound. Initial military reports often described comfort women with clinical detachment or, worse, with euphemisms that failed to capture the reality of sexual slavery. As direct interaction increased, however, language and understanding evolved. Major Robert Williams, who oversaw the repatriation of former comfort women from Okinawa, reflected this evolution in his monthly reports. His first report in June 1945 referred to women's facilities associated with Japanese military installations, while by September he wrote explicitly of sexual slavery, operations, and systematic rape as a military strategy. Williams later noted, "My own understanding transformed from seeing these as unfortunate, wartime excesses to recognizing them as crimes against humanity that demanded justice." This shift occurred not through policy directives, but through sitting with these women, hearing their stories, and witnessing their struggle to reclaim their humanity. This evolution of understanding influenced military policy as occupation planning began. Colonel Thomas Drake, who helped draft initial occupation guidelines for Japan, wrote in July 1945, "Our encounters with the comfort women system necessitate a fundamental reconsideration of occupation priorities. While initial planning focused primarily on demilitarization and political reform, we must now incorporate specific attention to gender-based atrocities and their remediation. This will require specialized personnel, medical resources, and judicial frameworks not previously contemplated. More broadly, we must recognize that the military culture we seek to transform in Japan is not merely one of external aggression, but one that normalized the systematic dehumanization of women, particularly women from colonized territories. Addressing this aspect of Japanese militarism will require more profound cultural intervention than originally anticipated. The impact of these encounters extended well beyond the immediate post-war period. For Korean society, the comfort women issue remained largely suppressed until the 1990s, when surviving women, then elderly, began publicly sharing their experiences. The silence stemmed from multiple sources. American occupation authorities focus on rebuilding Japan as a Cold War ally. The Korean government's reluctance to address painful colonial history, and the women's own shame in a society where female chastity remained highly valued. When Kim Hak-soon became the first former comfort woman to testify publicly in 1991, she opened a floodgate of historical reckoning that continues to this day. For the American military personnel who encountered comfort women, the experience often prompted lifelong commitments to human rights and women's issues. Lieutenant Sarah Jacobson, the Army nurse who treated Korean survivors in the Philippines, returned to civilian life and established one of the first rape crisis centers in Minneapolis in 1973. In her founding documents, she explicitly cited her wartime experiences. "What I witnessed in those comfort stations showed me that sexual violence is not merely an individual crime, but can be weaponized as a tool of power and domination. The Korean women I treated taught me that survival requires not just medical care, but recognition, justice, and community support." This center aims to provide all four. Captain Eleanor Johnson continued her medical career specializing in trauma recovery, developing innovative approaches to treating survivors of sexual violence based on her work with comfort women. In a 1962 medical journal article that broke new ground in trauma studies, she wrote, "Traditional psychiatric approaches prove inadequate for victims of prolonged, systematic sexual abuse. The experiences of the Korean comfort women I treated demonstrated that recovery requires addressing not only individual psychological trauma, but cultural and community dimensions as well. Survivors must reconstruct not just personal narrative, but social identity and place." Our current medical models, focused exclusively on individual symptom reduction, fail to address the full dimensions of recovery from weaponized sexual violence. Sergeant James Baldwin, the military photographer who documented comfort stations, maintained correspondence with several survivors he had photographed. In 1978, he organized an exhibition of his photographs at the University of California, Berkeley, titled Forgotten Victims, Korean Comfort Women. The exhibition catalyzed one of the first academic studies of the comfort women system in the United States. Baldwin wrote in the exhibition catalog, "These photographs remained classified for nearly 20 years, deemed too sensitive for public viewing. This classification served not military security but political convenience, allowing Japan's wartime atrocities to be minimized in service of Cold War alliances. The women in these images deserve to have their experiences acknowledged and their courage honored. Their stories are not footnotes to the Pacific War, but central to understanding its true nature." Private First Class Daniel Cooper, whose unit had liberated comfort women on Okinawa, returned to Nebraska after the war and eventually became a state legislator. In 1987, he sponsored one of the first state resolutions acknowledging the comfort women issue. Writing to a Korean survivor, "What I witnessed that day in 1945 has never left me. While America's strategic interests often dictated silence about Japan's wartime conduct, those of us who saw firsthand what you endured have a moral obligation to ensure this history is not erased. I may be just one small-town legislator in Nebraska, but I will use whatever platform I have to honor your courage and demand recognition of these crimes against humanity. This resolution cannot undo your suffering, but it represents my commitment that what happened to you will not be forgotten, at least not while those of us who were there still have breath to speak." The documentary, Evidence Preserved by American Military Personnel, proved crucial. Decades later, when comfort women sought official recognition and compensation, Captain Eleanor Johnson's medical records, Technical Sergeant Williams' translations of Japanese comfort station regulations, and Lieutenant Colonel Watson's comprehensive report provided verification that countered attempts to dismiss comfort women's testimonies as fabricated or exaggerated. When the Japanese government finally acknowledged official involvement in the comfort station system in 1993, they cited American military documentation as part of the irrefutable evidence they could no longer deny. Dr. Sarah Thompson, an archivist who helped declassify comfort women documentation in the 1980s, noted the importance of these American records. The detailed nature of American military documentation provided crucial independent verification of survivor testimonies. When comfort women began speaking publicly in the 1990s, they faced accusations of exaggeration or fabrication. The existence of contemporaneous medical records, intelligence reports, and photographs created by neutral third parties who had no political agenda in 1945 proved invaluable in establishing historical truth. Without these American records, preserved for decades in military archives, the comfort women might have faced even greater challenges in having their experiences acknowledged and validated. For individual survivors, the impact of their brief encounters with American liberators often resonated throughout their lives. Park Jong-suk, interviewed for a documentary in 1998, recalled, "The American medical officer who treated me was the first person in 3 years to touch me with gentleness, to ask permission before examining me, to see me as a human being rather than an object. She gave me a mirror. I had not seen my own face in years. I barely recognized myself. I had aged decades in those 3 years. But in her eyes, I saw that she still saw a person worthy of dignity. This moment sustained me through many dark years when I questioned whether I deserved to live after what had happened to me. 50 years later, I still have that mirror." Choi Young-hee, who was 16 when American forces discovered her in a comfort station on Luzon, maintained correspondence with the Army nurse who had treated her for over 40 years. In her final letter before the nurse's death in 1989, she wrote, "You asked me once how I survived all those years of darkness without losing my mind. I never answered because I did not know myself. Now looking back as an old woman, I understand. It was because even in that hell, I kept one small piece of myself hidden where they could not reach, memories of my grandmother's voice, the smell of persimmons in our village, the feel of my mother's hand on my hair. Each night before sleep, I would return to these memories, reminding myself that I had been someone before I became a number in their book. Your kindness when you found us showed me that I could be someone again, not just a survivor of what they did, but a woman with a future. This knowledge was your true gift to me, more valuable than the medicine or food. You helped me remember I was human when I had almost forgotten. The legacy of these encounters extends into international law and human rights standards. The comfort women system has become recognized as one of history's clearest examples of sexual slavery and a crime against humanity. Military training protocols in many nations now explicitly address sexual violence in conflict zones, citing the comfort women system as a cautionary example. United Nations Resolution 1820, passed in 2008, which recognizes sexual violence as a tactic of war and a threat to international security, drew directly from the historical evidence of the comfort women system. The Women's International War Crimes Tribunal, held in Tokyo in 2000, used American military documentation of comfort stations as foundational evidence in its proceedings. Professor Jennifer Richardson, an international law scholar who has studied the comfort women issue for 3 decades, notes the lasting legal impact. The comfort women case represents a crucial development in how international law conceptualizes gender-based violence and conflict. Prior to this case gaining international attention in the 1990s, wartime sexual violence was largely invisible in legal frameworks, treated as an inevitable byproduct of conflict rather than a specific crime requiring accountability. The documented, systematic nature of the comfort women system, revealed through survivor testimony and American military records, helped establish sexual slavery as a distinct category of war crime. This recognition has influenced everything from the Rome Statute establishing the International Criminal Court to United Nations peacekeeping protocols. While justice for individual comfort women has remained elusive, their collective testimony has transformed how international law addresses sexual violence in all subsequent conflicts. For both South Korea and Japan, the comfort women issue remains a diplomatic flashpoint, symbolizing broader, unresolved historical grievances. Each Japanese statement of remorse has been analyzed for its completeness, each compensation offer scrutinized for its adequacy. The few surviving comfort women, now in their 90s, continue to hold weekly demonstrations outside the Japanese embassy in Seoul. These elderly women, once silenced by shame and political expediency, have transformed into powerful symbols of resilience and the ongoing struggle for historical justice. Their journey from sexual slavery to moral authority represents one of the most remarkable transformations of the post-war era. Their voices eventually heard across decades and continents. Kim Bokdong, who was forced into sexual slavery at the age of 14 and became one of the most prominent comfort women activists before her death in 2019, exemplified this transformation. From a terrified girl who believed she would die anonymous in a comfort station, she became an internationally recognized human rights advocate who testified before the United Nations and established a foundation supporting victims of sexual violence in contemporary conflicts. In her final public address in 2018, she stated, "When American soldiers opened that door in 1945, I thought my suffering was ending. I did not understand that my journey was just beginning. For almost 50 years, I carried my story in silence, believing no one would listen or care. When I finally spoke out, I discovered that bearing witness has a power that transcends personal healing. It can change laws, challenge governments, and ensure that future generations learn from our pain. I was once told I was worth less than a bullet in the Emperor's army. Today, my voice reaches further than any bullet could travel. The American soldiers, who first discovered these women in places like Leyte and Luzon, could not have imagined the historical significance of these encounters. They acted from immediate human compassion, offering food, medical care, and basic dignity to women who had been denied all three. Yet, in these simple acts of humanity amid war's devastation, they participated in the first step of a long journey toward recognition and justice. The Korean comfort women, once deemed military supplies by one army and unexpected survivors by another, ultimately claimed their own narrative, transforming from hidden victims to powerful witnesses whose testimony would eventually force a global reckoning with wartime sexual violence. Their story demonstrates how historical truth, though it may be suppressed for decades, eventually finds its voice, often through the preserved records and memories of those who first confronted its reality. As Kim Bok-dong, one of the last surviving comfort women, stated before her death in 2019, "I was not freed the day American soldiers opened the comfort station door. True freedom began the day I found the courage to speak my truth and demand the world listen." That day came 46 years later, but it finally came. The discovery of Korean comfort women by American forces in 1944 represented more than a military encounter. It was a moment when two profoundly different value systems collided in the most intimate possible context. One system had rationalized sexual slavery as a military necessity. The other, despite its own imperfections, recognized a fundamental crime against humanity that demanded response. What began as a tactical discovery during military operations evolved into a moral reckoning whose implications continue to reverberate through international law, diplomatic relations, and human rights standards. The journey that began when Lieutenant James Caldwell broke open that padlocked door on Lady continues today in international courts, academic research, and the ongoing struggle to ensure that systematic sexual violence is recognized not as an inevitable byproduct of conflict, but as a crime that demands accountability. The Korean comfort women, once seen as disposable by their captors, have achieved a form of justice perhaps more powerful than legal verdicts. They have permanently altered how the world understands and responds to sexual violence in conflict, ensuring that future victims may not face the same decades of silence they endured.